As you guys continue your chat introductions, I'm going to do my own introduction, and then we're going to jump into the webinar. So hello and welcome. I'm Elena Dunn. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Admissions at Palo Alto University. I'm really excited that you're all here. As I mentioned, I've done this webinar a couple of times, and it is absolutely one of my favorites. So I'm really excited to be presenting with you today. The plan for today is that we're going to go over the interview, sort of how to prepare for your PhD interview. Now, some of the things we're going to talk about are relevant to really any interview. So employment interview, interviews at other schools, etc. Some of them are going to be really specific to the PhD interviews that we host here. So if you are scheduled to participate in the PhD interviews starting this weekend through March at PAU, this is going to be full of information specifically for you. If you're waiting to hear or you're just thinking about interviewing next year, I think the information will still be useful and relevant. So I have some prepared slides I'm going to go through. If at any point you have questions, feel free to ask them. The easiest way with a group this size is to ask them in the chat. And then once we're done, we'll end the presentation, and then I'll stick around and answer questions that you have, and we can do those either chat or with raised hands. Okay, is that good with everyone? All right, so give me 1 second. I am going to share my screen. All right, can everyone see the presentation? All right. Okay, so as we said, this is preparing for your PhD interview. So today we're going to do talk about interviews and what role they play. Why might you hear about interviews versus holistic admissions and what those two things mean, and really how do they interact together. Then we'll get a little bit more specific. We're going to talk about preparing for the interview, and we're going to talk specifically about our PAU interview, what it looks like, timeline, all that good stuff. Okay. So you may have heard the term holistic review, and holistic review means different things to different schools. Generally, what it means is that schools will not employ what you might think of as an algorithm to admit students. So there are some schools where they'll sort of give you a score for your GRE, they'll give you a score for your GPA, they'll give you a score for your research, etc. And whoever rises to the top with the biggest scores win and are admitted. A lot of schools, and PAU included, have moved away from that model and towards the model of holistic review. And holistic review in this context really means looking at the whole person. So we know test scores, grades, they don't tell the full story. And so we try and look contextually at all of the components of the application to see not only what has the student achieved, but what have they achieved within the context of their own life, within the context of the resources available to them and distance traveled, right? So your test scores and someone else's test scores may mean very different things depending on the resources you had growing up, you know, the access you had to test prep, for example. All of those things become relevant. So for us, that process starts with the initial review. So everyone who applies, their application goes to our admissions counselor, and the admissions counselor reads everything. Everything that you submit is read by the admissions counselor, and they will decide of the pool of applicants who sort of rises to the level of interview. You know, if you get an interview invitation, that means that we have holistically reviewed your application, your printed materials, and we want to know more, right? So we want to know things about you that we couldn't glean from the written materials, right? So here at PAU, the interviews are one-on-one interviews. So there's you and one faculty member, and then another interview that's you and one student. Now, this may look different at different schools. Different schools might do unstructured interviews. They might do MMI interviews, they might do group interviews. Here at PAU, we employ a one-on-one interview model. Now, once the interview's done, both of your interviewers will do what we call an interview write-up. And that basically is their impressions of you within the interview, as well as their impressions of your written materials. And all of that comes together in order for them to present what they think is the appropriate action for your application. And all of these go to the Faculty Admissions Committee, which convene and look at all of the applications, all of the write-ups, and make decisions about who to admit, who to put on the wait list, and who to deny. Okay, so decisions here at PAU are faculty-based. Okay, depending on the program, it could be that you have an admissions committee that is staff making the decision. That's more unusual at the doctoral level. Or it could be a person. So for example, if you're applying to a lab, then it might just be that PI, that lab director, who's making the decision. So each model can be a little bit different. So why interview? Well, we talked a little bit about the fact that the interview serves as a way for us to learn information about you that we can't glean from the application, right? So that's important to keep in mind. Our goal is not to have you kind of regurgitate what you've already put in the application. So we're looking a lot at interpersonal skills, at your fit for the institution, your motivation, how you present yourself, how do you make the interviewer feel? On the interviewer's perspective, there are kind of three main goals. First is, like I mentioned, it's an assessment, right? So we're looking at your interpersonal and cognitive factors that will apply and are relevant to a clinical psychology program. We're also trying to assess the extent to which you're a match for PAU, meaning that your kind of passions, interests, personal qualities are a good fit for what we offer. And also that, your values and how you behave in a group are aligned with our values as an institution and, the values of your peers. And then finally, it's an opportunity for you to learn about us. So, you can assess us based on the kind of questions we ask you, right? So there's a give and take to this experience. Every interview process is varied. In our process, our student interviewers go into the interviews blind. So they have not read your materials. They know nothing about you other than your name. So they will not have looked at your resume. If they ask you a question about research, you may need to briefly explain what your research experience is because they have not reviewed it. The faculty are encouraged to do blind interviews, but they don't always do that. So it may be appropriate to ask at the beginning, I don't know if you've read my materials or not. If you can let me know if you've seen them, that will help me decide how much background information to offer and, how much detail to give. Other schools, it will really vary. I would say most of the time, if you're meeting with a faculty member for a PhD interview, they probably will have read your materials before you go into the interview. Okay, but it's okay to ask that going in. Okay. So how do you prepare for the interview? And again, I'm taking it from the perspective of a PhD in clinical psych interview, but a lot of this advice will apply for any interview, whether it's for an internship, whether it's for your first full-time job, or your 50th job. It can be very helpful information. So first of all, why is the school or institution a good fit for you, right? Why did we catch your eye? Why is how we do clinical psychology education a good fit for your personality, for your interests? It's important to know, for example, that PAU is a very clinically focused PhD program, right? So why is that helpful? Why is that align with your goals, right? What is our mission? What are our values? And how does that align with your identity and your goals as well? Second is to be prepared for the interview type. So as I mentioned, we use a structured one-on-one interview that's via Zoom. There are things called multiple mini interviews in which you kind of move around station to station and do different activities. There are group interviews, all different kinds. So it's totally appropriate for you to ask prior to the interview, what's the format of the interview? Because if you're going to practice, you want to practice in the way that the interview is formatted, right? You don't want to practice your one-on-one interview skills if you're going to be doing an MMI, right? You'll be immediately thrown off guard and sort of be discombobulated if you show up for an MMI unprepared to be moving around and doing different activities. So be sure to ask. Second, it's important to understand the profession and the context of the profession, right? So I put a couple of books and industry publications up there. It's really important to know a few key issues in psychology, right? So not just, I know what I learned in my classes, I know theory, but what are the current issues facing practicing psychologists or those in academia? What are practicing psychologists saying about current affairs, right? And things that are happening in the world. Are there particular concerns or stresses around the industry, right? I mean, what comes to mind to me is like billing, right? Insurance billing, Medicaid, those sorts of things, right? The actual practical approach to being a clinician. So I really recommend that you get up to date with what's going on in the industry. The other is, it's really important to be reflective about what has happened. And I put the challenges of 2022, really it's the challenges since about 2019, right? Which is the pandemic paired with sort of racial reckoning, health disparities, right? Your potential industry, clinical psychology, is intimately involved in these conversations. So you really do want to be thoughtful about not just how these last few years have affected you, but the way that you see the last few years affecting how you might become a clinician, a therapist, or researcher. So I do encourage you to engage in reflection around those issues. And there are many, many excellent resources out there. And the thing I think we do the least, and I know I'm guilty of this, I tend to spend a lot of time focusing on the institution, right? When I go to an interview, I can tell you everything about the institution, and then I get flustered because they spend most of their time asking me about me, right? So you do need to engage in self-reflection because many of the questions will be, tell me about you, right? In a bunch of different ways. So you can reference these slides later. You don't need to write them all down, but really think about examples in your life to answer some of these questions, because most of the questions that you're asked are going to ask not just how you feel about something, but about an actual experience that you've had. And so the best thing you can do is spend time understanding yourself well. Now, that's a good practice anyway, right? If you're going to become a clinical psychologist, you should be doing that regularly. However, in preparation for the interview, plan to talk about yourself quite a bit and to have good answers to some of these core questions about your values and your goals. You also, I think for many interviews, but particularly for academic programs and particularly for PAU, you need to reflect on DEI and social justice issues. These are a couple of questions that I found, I didn't write these, that I thought were really, really good. So especially if you are white identified, especially if you are cisgender, especially if you do not hold any identities that are traditionally marginalized, you need to do a lot of work around this. And again, it's going to be true of almost every institution of higher education, especially true at PAU. That is one of our core values. It's a thread that runs through all of our curriculum. And it's going to be something I guarantee you're going to be asked about in both interviews, here at least. So it's really important to begin the work of thinking about these things, then again, how they relate to the kind of person you are, who you will be in the classroom, and who you will be as a future clinician or researcher or academic. There was a question, will we have access to the recording of this webinar? Yes, I will make it available to you as well as the slides. The other thing that I really encourage you to do, and this is something that often throws me in an interview, is I have a generic answer to a question, but I struggle to have a specific answer to a question, right? These are called situation-based interview questions. And so these are some examples, but they often start with, tell me about a time when, right? The reason that interviewers use these is that research shows us that your past behavior is the best predictor of your future behavior, right? So it's great for you to say, well, this is how I think I would act, right? And it's good to have those answers. But I find it really useful to have a list of examples that I have just written out that I can refer to, because the number one thing that happens to me is I will blank out. I will freeze when someone asks me for a specific question, even though I know I have 10 examples. So it's a really good idea to have a list of situations that you can call upon easily to answer some of the more common questions. It's good to have them relate to behavioral health, to clinical psychology. It's also good to have them relate to things like managing conflict, problem solving, those kind of key skills that you're going to need to use when you're here. You don't need 50 of these, right? And many situations relate to multiple characteristics, right? So an issue that requires problem solving and diplomacy and tact and getting something wrong, it could be all the same situation, right? So have a couple of good examples that you can draw on that apply to maybe a couple of scenarios, but also have a few of them so you're not always referring to the same situation. Okay. The next piece of advice is be aware of body language. Oh, it got cut off a little bit. So I want to first acknowledge that this is highly cultural, right? So body language and what is expected in terms of body language, as is of many parts of interviews, is very culturally informed. So there's not necessarily a correct answer, but it is something I think that's important for folks to think about, right? Generally, in kind of Western cultures, things like eye contact, confidence, sitting up straight, making, a strong handshake. These are things that generally are expected and can, although maybe it shouldn't, reflect something about you, right? So I think it's important when you practice, you might even want to videotape yourself and see, are you fidgeting? Are you looking away a lot? Are you biting your fingernails? Are you playing with your glasses? We don't often realize we're doing that until we see ourselves on tape, right? And so it's being conscious of those things. Now, we will be on Zoom, so you really only have to worry about your body language from here up, which is great. But if you're thinking about any in-person interviews that you might go to, that is something that often we have to attend to because it's not something we often think about on a day-to-day basis, okay? And a little bit of that last piece of advice is fake it till you make it, right? If you're not feeling confident, walk like you are, right? Because you don't want your body language to betray you, right? When you're saying really good content, you want someone paying attention to what you're saying, not how you're saying it, okay? All right, Zoom etiquette. I introduced this slide 3 years ago. We all have been on Zoom so much, it's probably not relevant anymore, but I just wanted to put it up here. Keep in mind, this is a more formal setting than when you're in a Zoom class, right? So you want to approach this in a more formal way. So, make sure that your lighting is good. Make sure the software works, right? Make sure you know where everything is, your computer's charged, all of that good stuff. The other thing is that to the extent that you can, try and minimize interruptions, right? And I know some of you have kids, some of you have pets, some of you have grandma's like in the background wandering around. I get it. To the best extent that you can, try and be in a quiet space with a good connection. be stationary. I did hear at some point, like a year or two ago, someone was in the car trying to do their interview. Be in a room, be in a stationary place, and try and minimize distractions. We know it's hard. And like if your cat jumps on your desk, it's fine. Don't freak out. Put them on the ground and move on. But it is something to think about and plan for. Don't multitask. So don't have other browsers open. Don't have your phone unmuted. Be able to focus. Dress appropriately. So I just think this photo is really funny about the guy who wasn't wearing pants. I mean, you don't have to wear pants, but I do recommend you wear pants. You want to be business casual or more from the waist up. So what that means for you can vary. You might want to wear a jacket. You don't have to. You might want to wear a tie. You don't have to. But I would say more formal is probably better than more casual. The other thing is that this will vary school to school. So PAU is on the West Coast. We got a pretty casual vibe. You know, I don't think it's a big deal if you're not going to wear a tie, but there are other schools that are more formal. And so you probably want to scope it out, like what's expected. You don't want to be the most casual person in the room, and you don't want to be in a tux when everyone else is in, you know, slacks, right? So do try and get a sense of the place and what would be appropriate. Choose a plain background. Like my background right now is blurred. That's fine. Or, you know, just kind of plain room is good too, nothing distracting. And then finally, attend to pronouns. So in the past, PAU has had interviewers that use they, them pronouns. So just be attentive. It's okay at the beginning to introduce yourself, give your own pronouns and say, do you mind sharing your pronouns just so I get it right? Some will have you know, their pronouns in their Zoom tag, so you can know that right away. But it is appropriate to ask just so that you're sure to get it correct. Okay. One of the hardest things to do, but one of the best assets you have, is to let your personality come through. Right. We have not made a mistake in inviting you to these interviews. Okay, something about your material said, we want to know more about this person. And what we want to know is who you are. So do try and be authentic, try and be confident, stay true to yourself. Don't tell us what we want to hear. Tell us what's actually true for you. What you don't want, and I know it's counterintuitive, you do not want to be admitted to a school that you had to lie to get into, because 5 years is a really long time, right? You want to be admitted to the schools that really want you and feel like you're a good fit. The other thing to know is we're not out to trick you, right? We're not trying to make you stumble. We don't want to see you fail. The questions we ask are not designed to be tricks. They're really just designed to, you know, see who you are and whether you would thrive at this place. So I know you're going to be full of nerves, but do your best to calm yourself down and really be present in the moment. The other thing that's really important is to prepare good questions and to prepare questions that are specific to the people you're meeting with. So you want to have some questions for your faculty interviewer, and you want to have some questions for your student interviewer that recognize the different roles they have and the different perspectives that they will have within the university. So first thing is to ask stuff you actually care about. So don't ask a question just because you want to be impressive. That's a waste of your time. Use the few minutes that you have to ask questions, to really ask questions that will help you decide, is this a place I want to be? Right? So that's first. Ask questions that are relevant to the person's experience, right? So you don't necessarily want to ask a faculty member, tell me about clubs and organizations, right? That's not really their job. So you probably want to ask faculty about research opportunities or mentoring relationships or, networking opportunities at the professional level. That would all be appropriate questions to ask faculty. And have a couple. You probably will not have enough time to ask all of them, but having a few means that you're not kind of deer in the headlights if they're brief in their answers or if you kind of run out of time. Oh, Albert asked, do we get to know our interviewers ahead of time? Yes, you will find out about 2 days before, so you will have time to research who they are. Now, you should already know who your faculty interviewer is because you're selecting them directly, but you'll know your student interviewers about 2 days before. The other flip side of that is to avoid weak questions, right? And this can really communicate what you care about, where your priorities are, can indicate a lack of confidence in yourself or someone who doesn't really want to do a lot of work. You probably already know this, but a PhD in clinical psych is not a good program if you're a slacker. You're going to do a lot of work, right? So avoid questions that indicate maybe you don't really have a high level of commitment to this program. And also avoid questions that ask about things that your interviewer won't know. Financial aid is a great example. Your interviewers will not be able to talk to you in much depth about how you might pay for this program. They might tell you their own experience, but that's a better question for financial aid, right? The other thing is you shouldn't be asking questions that you should have researched yourself. For example, what's the difference between a PhD and a PsyD? You should not have gotten to this point if you don't understand that, right? So like the basic things that you can find on the website, don't waste their time with those. They're going to think like, oh, this person didn't put any time into preparation, right? If you have basic questions, I'm the person you should be asking that of, right? Okay, there are no dumb questions for Elena. I will answer anything you have, but be thoughtful about what you're asking these faculty members because their time is precious, and you want to make good use of it. Right. All right, some talking points that have come up over the last couple of years. Number one, how much detail about my research should I be prepared to discuss? You will not necessarily need to get in a ton of depth into your research. For faculty, if they really want to know about your research, they probably will read your CV or resume, okay? It's good to have, a brief description of what you've done. I would be very surprised if they would ask you, say, about methods, right? Like tell us what sort of statistical analysis you did to reach your conclusions. You're probably not going to get in that much depth, right? So high level is probably appropriate. Should I discuss my specific areas of emphasis or faculty labs in which I would like to work? It's good to know an answer to this. The thing is that we do our best to make sure that you interview with someone that's in the area that you're interested in. This isn't always possible. So, you may not be able to ask questions of someone about a lab that they don't work in, right? But that means that you should have some questions that are more general, like, what is the relationship at PAU between a lab director and their students, right? Things like that. If you have a specific lab you'd like to work in, you have specific research you'd like to do, that's all great to share. Just know that you may be sharing it with someone who isn't directly involved in that kind of research. Is it appropriate to share personal goals along with professional goals if the question is what are your long-term goals? I would say that professional goals are a safer choice in this context. Personal goals, I think, are fine if you can relate them to the discipline of clinical psychology. I wouldn't necessarily say, one of my personal goals is to be able to compete in the Ironman in 5 years, right? Unless it's somehow related to clinical psychology in some way. So I think personal goals are okay. But I would probably lean more towards academic or professional goals, if given the choice. Is it appropriate to ask about job prospects post-PhD? It is appropriate, but again, you're going to get a very narrow answer. So your faculty members and your students, they're only going to be able to tell you what they know, and what they know is going to be the students that they've mentored, right? So you could certainly say, can you tell me about some examples of what your graduates have gone on to do? They'll probably be happy to talk to you about that. Just know it won't necessarily be reflective of the greater experience of students at PAU or at the institution writ large. I have several broad research interests I would like to study. Can't say for certain what research topics. Will that count against me if I don't know what my area of research is? Sorry, there's some typos in there. I must have cut and paste. No, it is okay for you not to be absolutely sure about what your research interest is. Again, we are a different kind of PhD program. You're not applying to a specific lab. I would say that you need to be able to speak intelligently about some of your research interests, though, right? You don't want to go into the interview saying, I really don't care what I research. I'm willing to research anything, or I don't really know anything about research. You do want to be able to indicate that PAU is a good fit for some of your research interests, right? So if you came to me and said, I really am interested in researching, psychedelics, or, working with individuals with autism spectrum disorder. We don't have anyone doing that right now, right? So you do want to have some research topics that relate to what we are doing so that we know the fit is there. When asked about my passions, how do I make sure I don't go on a tangent? This is why you practice, right? So you are probably going to be asked about a topic that you really light up about, and that's great. We want you to light up. But you do want to be succinct because you don't want to derail the conversation. Some faculty are good at interrupting, most aren't, and most will let you ramble and take up the whole time. And you don't want to do that because then maybe they've only had a chance to ask 1 or 2 questions of you. So practice, know what you're passionate about and why, and be sure that you have the ability to shorten that answer. So practice, record yourself, have someone watch you, whatever you need to do. But remember, you only have a half hour, so you want to make those answers pretty succinct. Someone last year asked, is a good question to ask whether there are any concerns they have about our resumes. I know there's like a TikTok going around about like, this is the key question you're supposed to ask. I think it's okay to ask that, but just keep in mind your interviewers may not have looked at your materials yet. So, they may not be able to answer that question. I may frame it as, is there anything about my, materials that you wanted to know more about, or that I can, expand upon for you? I think that takes a more positive kind of asset-based spin on it. And should I explain my lower GPA or gaps in study? I wouldn't explain it unless they ask. I would not bring it up. Because like I said, we've already reviewed all of your materials. If we were really concerned, you wouldn't have gotten an interview invite. And if the interviewer is concerned, they will bring it up. As a side note, if you are concerned about GPA gaps in study, it is absolutely appropriate for you to meet with me, or for you to provide an additional written statement that we can add to your application if you didn't do that already. So that is fine. But again, I wouldn't choose to bring up potential deficits if it doesn't seem to concern the interviewer, right? You don't want to plant ideas in the interviewer's head about things they maybe should be concerned about. Okay. Dania, you asked if we applied to the PhD or the PsyD program, do they also do interviews? They do. They take a different approach to interviews. They're smaller and they do lots more over the course of the spring, the winter. But they do faculty and student interviews. So it's similar in that way. Okay, red flags. Vague answers. So you again, we talked about specific ideas. You want to know specifically why you want to come to PAU. You want to know specifically what kind of research you might want to engage in. So avoid vague answers because they really do benefit, and it doesn't tell us anything about you. Really short answers. So we talked about rambling. Really short answers are also problematic because it sort of can show that you can't expand on an idea. So there is kind of a sweet spot. I would aim for 2 to 3 minutes per answer so that you keep the pace and you're not just seeming flippant or to kind of dismiss what the person has asked. An inability to thoughtfully engage with a topic. This especially comes up with DEI questions, right? And that's why I encouraged you more than once to engage with DEI concepts, especially if they will be challenging to you before you get in that situation. It's really hard to think on the fly about these really challenging topics. Glib answers. I wouldn't try and be funny if you're not funny. Know your limitations. Don't try and be cute or flippant. You should, if given the question, be serious versus try and be funny. That's a better choice. Try too hard to be perfect. We know you're not perfect. None of us are. We know that you've probably just come out of undergrad or a master's degree. You're going to a doctoral program because you don't know everything. So if you don't have a good example, it's okay to say, I don't have a good example for that, but let me tell you how I might approach that, right? So don't try and be too slick. Don't try and give the right answers. These are clinical psychologists. They're really good at seeing when people are putting on a show. Be yourself. I mentioned lack of self-reflection about diversity. This is DEIB, DEIJ, all of that stuff. You need to put the time in. Not doing your homework. So not knowing about us, not understanding who we are, not understanding the basics of our program. Really, really a poor look for candidates. And then lack of ability to connect. Now, this is not something you can always control, but do keep in mind that this is a clinical psychology program with a very strong clinical emphasis. We are expecting folks that are reasonably personable, that are empathetic, that have those skills that are going to be important in a clinical setting. So again, if you are concerned that your nerves are going to get in the way, practice leveling yourself out when you're in stressful situations so that you're not coming across as sort of disconnected or distant or having difficulty connecting with your advisor, with your interviewer. Couple of questions in the chat. Julie asked, are the interview dates established yet for the PhD program? Yes. First interview weekend is this weekend, and they run all the way through the third weekend in March. But we are still sending out interview invitations. And Alejandro asked, when can you expect to hear back regarding the PhD or PsyD programs? PhD should be within the next week or two because our materials deadline just passed. So that should be soon. The PsyD is hard to predict because they get so many applications. So, it could be within the next few weeks. It could not be until March. So they have a much wider window of when they will let students know. This is old-fashioned, but you should still follow up. You should still send a thank you note or card. I mean, these days they're almost all email. A card is not necessary. But do say thank you. Whether or not it makes a difference in, the outcome of your interview is debatable, but these folks don't have to do the interviews. They choose to participate. And so it's nice to just let them know that was really useful and helpful. Okay. So now let's go specifically to the PAU interview weekends. So this is the schedule. It's a 2-day extravaganza. You start on Friday, you go through Saturday. Friday is mostly just an opportunity to learn about PAU. Saturday is some information in the morning. We'll do an orientation and a clinic panel. And then the interviews run from 12 to 4:10. Now, you are not in interviews that whole time. You are in interviews for 2 half-hour sessions, so an hour total. And we try and do them back to back. So you might have downtime before it's your interview window, or you might go right away at 12. So we will let you know what your times are once we send out the final schedule, but just know that 12 to 4:10 is not all interviews. It's just you'll have one chunk of that time. Here is the PhD, again, PhD, not PsyD selection timeline. So here are the dates. We're going to do 2 decision releases this time. So we're going to do 3 interview weekends and a decision release, 2 more and a decision release. We'll have 2 admitted students weekends, 1 in person and 1 virtual. And then the enrollment confirmation deadline will be April 15th. And that should be universal. Pretty much every clinical psych program will ask you to make your decision by that date. Some questions about the interview weekend. Most interview weekends for us have about 50 participants. Some are a little bit smaller, some are a little bit larger. Just depends on how many interviewers were available. For this year, students pick the faculty member they'd like to interview with, and you'll get information about how to do that. We randomly assign the student interviewer. So it might be someone who has similar interests to you, it might not be, but their job is to interview you as a generalist. So, they're going to be assessing you generally, not necessarily for a specific fit for the program or lab. Pay attention to time. I tell you, a half an hour will fly by. So if you find that you lose track of time, set up your cell phone with a timer, do whatever you need to do to make sure you're on track. They will probably do brief introductions. They will ask you maybe 6 to 8 questions, and then they're going to try and leave time at the end for questions. If you run out of time for questions, keep in mind there are other opportunities to connect with faculty and students, so you will still have time to ask questions in other venues. Obviously, you should have your camera on. And this applies, I think, to the non-interview portions of the day as well. I know all of us kind of sometimes need to turn the camera off. That's okay. I wouldn't be the person who just has their camera off the whole time. It sends the wrong message about your kind of seriousness about the program and your engagement. If there's some situation where you need to have the camera off a lot of the time, it's best to let me know so that I realize that you're not being rude, but there's something else going on. Someone asked about the interview links. We will put them all on the interview website. So they're not up there yet, but 2 days before, so Thursday, we will send out an update saying, hey, the interview website is totally updated. You can find your interviewer pairings there, as well as the link for the various sessions. Confirming your acceptance, I just want to, you'll hear this again, but we are a limited size cohort. And so we will accept deposits or enrollments. There's not really a deposit up until we're full. And then we operate a wait list. So it is important once you know that PAU is where you want to come to, that you do accept your spot, because we offer, as every school does, we make more offers than spots that we have. Now, a lot of you are probably here because you were curious about the PsyD process. And I see there's a question about, does anything in this presentation not apply to the PsyD interviews? The general advice absolutely does. What does not apply is the timeline, the dates, or the schedule. So if you are invited for an interview, they will let you know what the schedule is, what the timeline is, all of that stuff, but they operate separately. So, the specifics that I'm giving you here will not apply to those PsyD interviews. And yes, I have the PsyD dates, but I don't have them right now. There's like 12 of them. So they run all the way through February and March. Okay, let's see what else. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to switch to just questions and answers.